Hello, my name is John Curry, and I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the history of Wargaming project. I'm basically a wargaming archaeologist. What do? I find something interesting, just like an archaeologist does. I get permission, I dig around to see what I can find, and I try to always publish the findings if I can. I'm also a professional academic wargamer. Uh, What do I do in professional wargaming? Well, basically, I play strange games with strange people in strange places. I think that's probably the only way of phrasing it, really. Just to let you uh, appreciate the fact I'm not really that successful. My most unsuccessful war game is during the Libyan Civil War, where we identified the best strategies for Colonel Gaddafi. That was the other side, by the way. I've blown up the world in nuclear bunkers many a time, very happily. And my biggest surprise in a war game was when I was doing it for the Pentagon, which was about a hypothetical trade war between the United States and China. I thought, no one would be daft enough to start one of those. And 30 days later, from the finish of the game, a trade war started. And some of the opening moves of America did look suspiciously like the ones they played out in the game. Apparently, everyone in the entire building, except me, knew that the trade war was about to kick off. So then I devised my rules of professional wargaming, and basically any professional wargame that's invited me to take part is immediately suspect. So how did the History of Wargaming project start? Well, actually by accident. So I played the Fletcher Pratt naval wargame for about 30 years off and on, a lot of fun, lying on the floor, estimate the range in inches, sticking out the golf tees, the red ones mean hit, white ones mean you've got a miss. And the Fletcher Pratt naval wargame was very successful 1939 to 1945. I mean, people from the United States Navy played in the game. So I'd done some work on it, the rules, revisions, some commentary, some ship cards, etc. And two members of Wargame Developments, that's John Bassett and Tony Hawkins, urged me to reproduce it. So I thought, well, okay. So I photocopied it myself, bound it myself, and started selling copies for £2 each. And you know what? It actually sold. So what happened next? Well, someone called Tom Moat, MBE, member of Wargame Developments, and is a very well-known, the professional wargamer in the UK, said, you need to publish this stuff. And I thought, yeah, right. Yes. So I published two books, Fred Jane and Verdi's Free Kriegspiel. Now, Fred Jane was the first really good, widely distributed, well-respected professional naval war game. He published it in 1898. So my book consisted of the rules, simplified introduction by Bob Corduroy, that's the wargaming blogger, some ship cards, commentary, etc. I thought perhaps 10 people in the world would buy this book, and I would know 8 of them. I published it on the Friday, did no publicity at all, and I noticed by the end of Sunday, 11 copies had sold, and I knew none of the buyers. Now, the Prussian Kriegspiel of the 19th century was really complex, and someone called Verdi suggested a free Kriegspiel, which is basically use the combat experience of the umpires. So instead of lots of tables, the umpires just, oh, this is the outcome, this is what happened. Now, a number of people who were interested in the history of wargaming knew of this book, but no one, of course, had ever seen it. There were very few copies. So what did I do? I just published it. I added the Victorian Army wargame from 1898, which shows how a military, the UK military, was implementing the Verdi Kriegspiel, and the book actually sold. And thus was born the History of Wargaming project. Now, what really launched the project was Donald Featherstone. Now, Donald Featherstone, I'm sure you all know, was one of the founding fathers of modern wargaming. He contacted me. I'd met him a few times. I can count him. I'd been a student in Southampton. He'd lived in Southampton. And he said he'd heard that I was publishing old wargaming books and basically said, why hadn't I contacted him? So once Don was on board, the others rushed to join. Many of the great names of early wargaming were in touch with me. And actually, some of them were a bit rude. They basically said, yeah, you're publishing the books. Why haven't you published mine? And some of them said, my books are actually more important than this other author's books. You should have published them first. So what does the project now include? It includes hobby books, I don't know, 80, 90, largely publicly accessible archive of professional wargaming material, maybe 30 books in that area, some serious games, for example, on cybersecurity, there's a handful in there, and some novels and history books, largely by Donald Featherstone. It also, behind the scenes, has a large archive, including private papers of some of the key figures of wargaming. I digitized about 76,000 documents in this archive. That archive is available for research, even though I can't publish it all. I also supervise PhD students who are pushing forward our understanding of wargaming. What are some of the best moments in the project? Well, I remember now, it wasn't so funny at the time. I had some pretty irate marks from book dealers at my crashing the second-hand wargaming book market. So Don Featherstone's solo wargames book was selling for, I don't know, £100 plus, if you could find one to sell you a copy. And here I was selling it for £11.95. And you can see some of these book dealers were not wildly happy at my entry into the market. Actually, another one was a sobering moment at Don Featherstone's funeral in Southampton. So at the appropriate moment, we all lined up and the family lined up, and then everyone waited. And I realized they were actually waiting for me to go in after the family, because of course I was Don's editor. Other moments, well, it's the knock at the front door and the postman delivers another bundle of paperwork, unsolicited, from somewhere in the world. My last lot was some material on Paddy Griffith's Mega Games from Jim Roche in Scotland. Hey, thank you, Jim. Much appreciated. So I never quite know what's going to arrive at the front door, or whether I'm going to get an email. Someone's going to say, oh, I've just found this. Would you like a copy? What are some of the highlights? Well, I spent about 30 years actually hunting for the Fletcher Pratt naval wargame. Talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The unpublished stuff by Don Featherstone, which I populated into his books, such as additional scenarios, rules, etc. And maybe the professional rules, such as the work on matrix games, cyber war games, and confrontation analysis, and that is definitely pushed forward the professional practice. So, an example of the hunt for material. So, Fletcher Pratt naval wargame was really quite important. Fletcher Pratt was a naval wargamer, a military historian. He also had monkeys, marsupials, I think, in his flat. He was quite a lively character. Oh yes, and he also wrote some of the early fantasy fiction. So anyway, Fletcher Pratt's wife was called Inga, and Inga stepped in at some of the games when Fletcher Pratt was away during World War II, and she was the chief umpire. And these games were huge, great games, 130 players, played on the floor of a ballroom in New York, multiple ships, very lively, often with naval officers taking part. Anyway, so after Fletcher Pratt passed away, Inga married Doc Clark. Doc Clark was Fletcher Pratt's umpire, his lead umpire. So anyway, Inga passed away, and then Doc Clark was engaged to be married to Carol Burnett Jones. Now, Doc Clark was involved in the American ICBM program. And Carol Burnett Jones was, well, an antiquarian book dealer. Think Indiana Jones. Anyway, he passed away. So Carol Burnett Jones never remarried, and she held the copyright. So I contacted her, and a magic moment when she said, "What, the Fletcher Pratt Naval War Game? What, you mean this?" And she had 2 shoeboxes full of unpublished material and correspondence about the game. So when I had that, I then hunted around and I looked for every single person I could find a reference to who'd played in the Fletcher Pratt Naval War Game during the war. And I found the last one was alive, Commander Bothwell, United States Navy retired, submarines, and he was living in Devon. So I went down to see him, and it was great actually talking to one of the people who'd played actually in the Fletcher Pratt Naval War Games, because he knew things which hadn't been written down. So that's an example of the type of thing which I do. Now, professional wargaming. Professional wargaming was largely unknown about in the hobby. There were basically a very limited number of wargaming analysts who used to keep to themselves, hardly share practice. But these games were important. I mean, they changed doctrine, they tested potential weapons, they explored different options and training. And we really, in the hobby sector, saw very little of this. I mean, Firefight by SBI 1976 was an example of a professional war game. It was produced by James Dunningham and SBI. It was sold to the US military, but it was also, due to contractual reasons, it was allowed to be sold to the public. Now, the game is a little bit funny in some ways that the terrain was simplified because the US military were keen to show that their anti-tank guided missiles could go a long way. So they got rid of things like power lines and trees and all those things which just get in the way, really. So the ranges are quite long. And Jim Dunningham had introduced morale rules. Obviously, he was a wargamer. And the American military didn't like the idea that the American forces might have a morale failure and run away. That was not the war game they wanted. So he took them out. So Jim Dunningham took them out for the Russian side too. Said, well, if the Americans can't run away, neither can the Russians. So I think that's quite funny. But there's an example of a professional war game. Now, the defence community was closed even to itself. Officers moved on, retired, material was classified, and they didn't really have any wargaming archives, which meant every generation of professional wargamers since World War II had largely reinvent the wheel. They had to work it out to what to do, how to use these games, how to apply these games, how to design these games, the practical mechanics of producing hex grids, etc. They had to reinvent it themselves. Now, Thomas Allen and Peter Perler had reported in some of their military games in their books, but there were huge gaps. So when I started hunting around, I discovered, for example, Dun Kemp. Dun Kemp was really widely played in the American military. It was a 1 in 300 scale miniatures game based on the Phil Barker's WRG modern rules. And the story of that game was almost lost. Every American unit had a copy of the game. It was widely used. And what did they do? They created terrain boards, which looked very similar to the training areas they were going to use. And they would routinely play out the exercises they were going to do on the ground on the war games table first to learn the lessons before they actually went and started using up track miles and all that fuel. When it was published, I had so many people contacting me saying, yeah, they took part in the game and they wanted a copy. But professional wargaming had forgotten it. So the History of Wargaming project has made so many examples of professional war games from the past readily available. And I've tried to produce handbooks of current practice, not as the active edge of cyber wargaming or matrix games, but more saying this is a baseline. Once you've read this and you've seen the examples, you can then take off and produce your own. Now, I've said many times since the start of the project, it's too early to write the definitive history of hobby and professional wargaming. I mean, there were people who did some groundwork, but my publications have changed. So many of these ideas, like H.G. Wells was not a bolt out of the blue. H.G. Wells's classic game was part of a series of war games. Donald Featherstone's War Games book, well, that was also part of a series of war games. He was building on the efforts of others. Now, we're starting to get a firmer grip on the development of hobby and professional wargaming now. And for example, Matt Caffrey's amazing book on wargaming, which is about the history of professional wargaming, it's free to download. Hey, thanks, US Navy. Good one. But even that, I would challenge it, has got errors in it. For example, I've only just published War Games from World War II. And this demonstrates that the evidence is that the Germans and Japanese were not the professional war gamers of World War II. Every side was using World War II, but actually the Britons and the Americans were playing more war games more effectively than the Germans were. So Matt is doing a second edition of his book. Oh, not just because of me, by the way. Right. So don't care what I said. We only just realised its importance. The demolition of the Fletcher Pratt naval game by naval wargamers said, no, the game was rubbish. Well, we now realise that's not true. It definitely adds something to the mix of understanding naval warfare. Fred Jane was not playing with toy ships. The Fred Jane game was serious, widely used by a number of navies, including the American, the Royal Navy, the Japanese, and the Russians. I've also answered along the way trivial questions such as what did Donald Featherstone actually do in World War II? He was in the Royal Tank Regiment, by the way. Who won Tony Bath's Hyborian campaign, the first fantasy campaign? Well, actually, it was Phil Barker. And what was the story of Paddy Griffith's Operation Sea Lion? Well, that's in another video. So, what's in a war game? When I meet anyone talking about the past or future conflicts, my eyes tend to glaze over when I realize they're not a wargamer. You see, when I talk to a wargamer or a wargame's put out in front of me, whether it be a matrix game, committee game, computer game, manual board game, miniature game, I can start to evaluate it. And I know the design, if it's a realistic game, is considered orders of battle, tables of organization equipment, military geography, time, space, weather, human terrain, summary of information such as quantitative data. You see, a war game is a model that I can rapidly evaluate. But when I meet someone and they give me an eloquent narrative about what's going to happen next in the conflict, or about why something has failed, I have no idea whether or not they've considered all those things I've just mentioned, because they all sound equally plausible to me. So that's why when I want to talk about war, I want to talk about a war game to inform my discussions. Now, the research which I've done, we're trying to apply lessons from wargaming to wider education. And now there are several books on training for cyber warfare. There are books on games for emergency planning in the health service. And there are books which are bringing together key innovations in wargaming for others to use. And this is all good practice. So what I do, I'm a wargaming archaeologist, and I've used research to create what James Dunningham referred to as a toolbox of wargaming techniques. So I can take any situation and start saying, oh, how can I potentially model this using the technique of wargaming? And the History of Wargaming project has definitely assisted me professionally. Absolutely, because I play strange games with strange people in strange places. So what's the future of the project? Gosh. Well, I've got 70 more books to publish on my to-do list, and I've got no doubt other people will suggest others. So what I think I should do is stop talking and carry on working on getting the next book published. Well, I hope you found that was an interesting introduction. to the history of wargaming projects.